Go ahead and get started. That works for everyone. Hello and welcome to our webinar about the important role of ESG data in multifamily real estate. I'm Amanda Studerbond, a senior ESG consultant at Conservice. Today we're going to review some of the challenges around ESG data facing multifamily operators and ways to overcome them, data acquisition and validation best practices, and strategies for broadening the scope of data acquired. We'll also examine different approaches and real-world examples of ESG implementation, methods for setting meaningful targets and goals, some ESG topics and issues that impact multifamily real estate, and more. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be distributed to everyone after the session. Second, we'll be saving some time at the end of the webinar to answer some questions. If you have a question at any point during the webinar, you can submit it on the GoToWebinar control panel in the question section. We'll attempt to answer as many questions as we can, but if we don't get to all of them, members of our team will follow up after the webinar to provide answers. With that out of the way, let's briefly introduce our speakers. Kara has 16 years of experience in the sustainability market across nonprofit, utility, and private organizations. She leads decarbonization and net zero thought leadership at ULI, specifically focusing on net zero mission priority Journey to Zero and campaigns around the real estate value chain for tenants, utilities, and embodied carbon. Kara has managed utility efficiency contracts as well as new construction, existing building, and campus green building projects. She has been involved in commercial real estate, ESG program strategy, and implementation. Kara is also an adjunct professor at American University in the Environmental Studies program, where she teaches courses in energy, pollution, and the environment. Kelly is a vice president at ESG at Mill Creek Residential, leading the firm's overall ESG strategy, including developing, collaborating on, and managing ESG programs, policies, and disclosures. Kelly has been in the multifamily industry for nearly 25 years and is skilled at connecting sustainability and social responsibility to overall corporate strategy, as well as designing and implementing organizational and cultural change efforts. She has a proven track record in developing successful sustainability, CSR, and ESG-related company programs from the ground up. Kelly is a frequent speaker at industry events, graduated with honors from Dominican University of California with a BA in Humanities and an MBA in Sustainable Business, and is a lead Green Associate, Fitwel Ambassador, and Green Globes professional. Nicola is a senior ESG consultant at Conservice. Nicola is part of an in-house strategic consulting team supporting clients with ESG strategy and program management, reporting to leading frameworks and ratings such as GRESB, CDP, SASB, and TCFD, and consulting on climate risk management approaches. Nicola has over 15 years of experience in the field of corporate sustainability, ESG reporting, and sustainability management, working with global companies and company leaders, advising in development, and then driving achievement of ESG objectives. She has worked with clients in the beverage, diamond industry, forest, and paper products, and financial service industries. With that, we will kick it off to Kara.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about ESG data and multifamily real estate. And I know in my bio, it does mention that I am an adjunct professor, but I wanted to mention that for this particular webinar, it's not meant to be a lecture. So I wanted to make sure that you all knew as listeners that we want this to be interactive with the panel. We're not going to lecture or have a bunch of slides. We want it to be conversational. And personally, for me, in my career, I never really thought that data would be something I could talk all day about, especially data in terms of sustainability. But here we are, and it's something that I personally get very passionate about because I think we probably have all heard on this call the common adage that you can't manage what you don't measure. And it's so important when we're talking about ESG and then the journey to net zero, because energy and building performance data is really the foundation of property owner and tenant collaboration on sustainability, because it can show you progress against goals It can support sustainability reporting, and it really optimizes the management of a particular asset, whether it's multifamily, office, or other, and improve that building's performance, and then ideally achieve net zero. So that's really why we're here today, to talk about why data sharing is important for net zero and the journey to net zero. At ULI and in the decarbonization team, we really describe the pathway to net zero as including and being inclusive of energy efficiency, on-site renewables, off-site renewables, grid interactivity, and then that tenant engagement piece is at the end. But data really flows through all of that. A lot of times, folks that we work with in our Greenprint members or our ULI members as a whole are dealing with either internal organizational goals or external pressures from investors or stakeholders that are really looking to hit those net zero goals, meet industry standards that require whole building data. And how do you collect whole building data if you are only operating a common area and not all of the area that the tenants or residents are inhabiting and utilizing? So there really has to be a collaborative effort between owner and operator and tenant or resident. There are also a lot of cities and states and countries that have passed energy benchmarking or disclosure ordinances that are really just requiring buildings to collect and submit this annual whole building energy data. So not just your common area, not just your area that you control, but this whole building energy data that includes your tenant spaces. And I would say that with the horizon, as we see it, that more and more jurisdictions and regions will be requiring that information in the future. So it really is important for property owners to start to figure out how to collect this data, not only again from the common area and the parts of the building they own and operate, but also the tenant space. But there are a lot of challenges in that. A lot of challenges that I've seen, either ULI members or previous clients face, are concerns about data privacy, or some options can be metering, but a lot of times there's a cost associated with some metering. So there seems to be a lot of challenges in collecting this data. But again, the benefits are something we should also focus on too. So Nicola and Kelly, if you have any thoughts on some challenges that you've seen folks face or some benefits or solutions, I'd say it'd be great to start talking about that now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to jump in, Nicola, if that's all right.
Sure.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely lots of challenges. I think for the biggest one, and I'll start with some of the challenges I've personally experienced, and then maybe just talk about some of the solutions that I've also seen that exist. First and foremost, I think the process of data quality and data coverage is everything. I mean, you said it, like you can't manage what you don't measure, and data is absolutely everything to ESG. You have to be able to tell your story and bring all of your stakeholders along with you so they understand where you're at, how you're progressing on your goals, and be transparent as well. You know, talk about what you're doing well and not doing well. And that process of kind of wrapping your arms around your data and getting, you know, good quality, clean, trustworthy data and good enough data, I should say, that data coverage so you can tell your story is really kind of an ongoing process. It doesn't ever end. And so it's important that first and foremost, you kind of have that mindset that this is something that every year you really should try to think about, okay, what data am I missing? What do we need to do to enhance and improve the data that I have? And just kind of slowly chip away at it, because we measure so much, and ESG covers so many different issues. It's not just the environmental data, it's the climate risk, right? It's the social stuff, and how you approach your data kind of collection process is really critical. You talked about it, Kara, that, you know, it's super easy where there's energy benchmarking ordinances where they exist. That's kind of a no-brainer. You've already got the data. But then thinking about what's your strategy to approach getting the rest of it. And one thing that we've been focusing on here at Mill Creek for the past year is thinking about, it's almost like a multi-pronged approach. You've got it in markets where those ordinances exist, and then thinking about, all right, what are the utilities that are easy to work with, that maybe they're not already feeding that data because of reporting, but how can I work with them easily and maybe get, you know, an addendum in my resident lease or waivers signed. So that's just kind of a no-brainer. And then the next priority is, okay, where they're hard to work with, then what do I have available to me? Submetering is not cheap. It's obviously cheaper if you do it at development and construction, so that's kind of something to keep your eye on, but maybe exploring the use of shadow or pulse meters and piloting that technology to see how it works, how the data comes through. There's a lot of different approaches, but it's not easy and it doesn't happen overnight, but kind of approaching it strategically is really key. The other challenge really is just time and resources. I mean, for everybody in this space, we have traditionally smaller teams, and data, you know, we often don't own the data in the ESG department solely. It comes from so many other departments, risk and HR, and you know, it's coming from our utility providers. And so you have to have that time to sift through it all and understand it, which is hard in and of itself, and to be able to make sense of the data so that you can understand where there's gaps and where you need to maybe tweak how the data comes through to help you in your reporting better. And so solutions that I've really found, you know, first and foremost is collaboration. Interdepartmentally, right? You're working with so many different departments, so that cross kind of functional approach is key. Collaboration with your vendors and making sure that every vendor you work with, the kind of ask of how do you report on the data that we're getting from you? What does it look like? Is it in the right format? That should really be part of that vendor kind of vetting process every time. You know, also I would say, you know, the kind of relationship you have with whether you're using a Conservice or some other vendor out there, but that kind of constant process of making sure that the data is QA'd, you know, regularly, that you understand what they're doing and they understand your goals and needs. So that kind of collaboration is really important. Nicola, I'll let you kind of chime in.
Yeah.
I've been rambling quite a bit.
Thank you for that segue and the sort of the importance really of having a third party perhaps be a data source for you. The data definitely is overwhelming. I just wanted to take a step back that certainly for companies that are multifamily operators, management companies that are just beginning their journey, you know, it's one thing talking about the data, but taking a few steps back is what data am I actually looking for? What data should I be tracking? What is material to my business from my stakeholders, the investors, my communities, tenants? And so there, it's really, there's a need for a sort of a materiality exercise because of course, you know, we know that the ESG space is, you know, it's huge. It's very hard to wrap your head around, arms around even. It's ever changing in terms of the key issues that investors are focusing. Obviously, net zero is very much in the space currently. And so if companies actually just take some time and go through more of a sort of systematic assessment of what is material to their business, both on the E side, the S and the G, so that they can figure out, okay, obviously on the environmental side, I know it is to do with the efficiency of my buildings. I know it is to do with my GHG emissions, but perhaps some of the S side is a little less clear. And what are the metrics there and goals that I can set and KPIs to track those goals? Because I can't address everything. Right? And so what is it, the, you know, the internal health, the wellness of my tenants, the communities at large where our properties are located, and to really prioritize and set a kind of a roadmap as to what is a priority to address and some of those indicators and the data to start collecting. Who do I reach out to? You mentioned it, Karen, Kelly. It's very much a cross-functional. There's no way that one single person within an organization can address that. And so you're going to need to reach out internally, set up cross-functional committees, task forces, so that there's collaboration and kind of accountability and buy-in right from the beginning to even get access to that data. First of all, to understand what that data is, to begin collecting it, and then really ideally to have a tracking tool of some kind, a data management system, as you say, very increasingly important just from an accuracy perspective, but certainly with the scrutiny around and the need, or increasingly the need around assurance. And that if your financial data is being assured by a third party, that they're really, why is your environmental data, your community investment data not also going under that same, lens of scrutiny at the same time? So I think, we can very much leap to the gaps and certainly the challenges and the barriers that we have, but I think also just to spend some time looking at and wrapping our arms around what the actual data is that we need to be looking for.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The materiality assessment is huge because you want to right size to your business what you're focusing on, and every business is very different. I think there's so many similarities across real estate, but there's also unique differences. And when you think about the S component too, I mean, that's really how you manage relationships with people and your stakeholders. And so what are all of those elements that, how you're addressing your stakeholders? So your health and safety, your, diversity, equity, and inclusion, your resident satisfaction, all of that. And just looking at those alone, there's a lot of different kind of data and metrics that you have to get your arms wrapped around. So it's really important, that exercise of walking through and understanding what's important to us. We can't boil the ocean, right? You can't address everything. And so making sure that you really pay attention to, okay, what are the key critical items that are really impactful to our business and to our personal stakeholders.
And that is absolutely correct. And also where some of the reporting frameworks are obviously, really a guide. Because doing a materiality assessment, you can look inward at the organization and ask internally, ask your leadership, ask employees what's important to you. You can obviously look at peers and see what they're focusing on and prioritizing and some of their challenges to sort of get a guide. But then really some of the reporting frameworks, obviously for the industry that we're here, for commercial real estate is really GRESB. And they, it's a very helpful guide as to what's already been identified across multiple stakeholders as these issues really should be, these should be material to your organization. If you're not able to look at some of these, next year or 3 years out, but these should certainly be included in your roadmap.
I really like that too, because using frameworks as a guide, but not being limited by frameworks is a good way to tell your story. And Kelly, I know you mentioned that earlier, how do you want to tell your ESG story and how can you use data to tell that story and really support it? So I think that's an important piece where an organization may have more sophisticated social programs that a framework hasn't addressed yet. So, continuing to dig deep there and making sure that those metrics are continuously tracked, because the frameworks will eventually catch up if, there's some movement in the industry, and using that piece of why we're different or why we're digging deeper in this particular area to be part of the ESG story. So I really think that's an important piece. Something I noticed that we all have said is that the data sharing piece has been a little slow. There's not an easy button. I know that some utilities do have that green button that connects all the data to each other, which is fantastic, but that's not always an easy fix. And I think the tricky part is one of the obstacles at that there's so many pathways to get data and there's so many pathways to share data. Some of the strategies that we focused on, and I'm going to go through them quickly, but I want to touch base on each of them a little bit deeper. The first one, data clauses in leasing, which isn't so applicable to multifamily, but Kelly, you mentioned having language in vendor contracts. So that's something really important to think about. It might not be in your leasing contracts, but in your vendor contracts, having specific language that calls out what you're collecting or what you need to collect. The other one being owner-tenant relations. We've all talked about that, how it's just another piece of the puzzle to make sure that collaboration happens. Then utility access, which can be easy when there are benchmarking ordinances in place. I talked to one of our ULI Greenprint members this week about where they're finding ordinances or where their assets are, and they said only about 10% of their current assets were in a market that isn't requiring benchmarking ordinances, which I thought was fascinating. So they're really focusing on getting that 90%, with the utility, and then how do I capture that last 10%? I know a lot of companies and funds are in the opposite situation. And then that last strategy, which Kelly, you touched on a little bit, is energy meters, but curious if either of you, starting with that last strategy, had any specifics about how energy meters or shadow metering can help solve that puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak just very briefly. We are very much at the early stages of exploring the shadow meters. It's definitely been something for this past year we've been exploring. So it kind of started with what's out there and how does it work, just understanding the technology. And then, we use the Gobi or Conservice ESG platform, and so looking for technologies that can help directly feed into it is also a plus, and so that was part of that kind of decision making. And then really we're all about pilots here, so trying to find the right project that's in an ideal market where we don't have access to data, so identifying potential pilot projects. And now we're working through, we just got approval, so now we have to work through installation and really just assess how it's working. But the hope is that we will be able to capture that whole building data in an easy way that's fed into the system we use to manage our energy, water, and carbon, and then kind of help fill that gap and then expand that technology across other markets.
Yeah, and to follow on from that, we certainly have clients that are piloting the sub-meters or have in fact installed them, certainly in their new builds, in their kind of the units. And sort of the feedback there is definitely, and the concern, of course, is that there is a cost, the additional cost of it. But speaking with some of our clients, they very much see it more, this is a capital investment in their buildings. And so obviously that kind of will have an impact on valuation. And then secondly, tenants actually being able to have a little more accountability on their usage can have a dramatic impact. And I think they saw like a 38% decrease in water usage just because suddenly the meter was clearly showing the tenant, whether they just turned the tap on or, actually bothered, while they were cleaning their teeth or something to turn it off and things. And then one just little example, obviously I realize this is very unique, but of course with the sub-meters across the sample of their portfolio, they were then very specifically able to certainly look at spikes very clearly. And in one of their properties, it was an extreme spike and they were able to narrow it down. And they found that the tenants were crypto mining. So yes, so that was certainly something that they were very happy that they could, identify. Obviously, I realize that's an extreme case, but certainly for high consumption users, definitely a great way to be able to identify that. And also, because kind of the counter to that is where you are then beginning and doing tenant engagement, very easily being able to see the impact that is having. And we've also talked to clients about a pilot study where they would, similar-ish units, but the idea was that we would do tenant engagement not on all floors, on sort of alternate floor spaces, over a set period of time, and then assess the data at the beginning, at the end, and then, obviously be able to check what that 3-month education awareness raising, what impact that would have. And they definitely felt that this would probably have a fairly significant, dramatic impact, in fact, and that although essentially it is spaces that they do not have operational control over, they very much felt, this is our building. We have installed all the equipment and the appliances. And so therefore it is their responsibility from an environmental impact assessment, as well as, of course, Kara, the other reason that we're here is for their goal setting, in order for them to really be addressing their a net zero target, that the tenant spaces would absolutely, certainly for multifamily, be over that 40% threshold for according to the science-based targets, SBTI, of their scope, of their total scope 1 and scope 2. And so absolutely, even if at this stage, or when companies may be jumping a little bit into the goal setting discussion, but that big audacious goals need to be set to sort of address the challenge, and that may not be, companies probably apprehensive to set some of those goals, not quite knowing, assets change, portfolios are changing, especially in our industry, but that just sort of not being shy to perhaps, look at it from a sample perspective or even a market, address your scope 1 and scope 2, set a goal around those. There's one example of a company that decided to set a net zero goal, knowing, being very open about the fact that they were very much relying on offsets to achieve that goal, but at the same time kind of laid a pathway that they will then go for an absolute net zero. So there's new terminology coming into this space as well, in that their net zero was going to rely on offsets, but that their absolute net zero would include embodied carbon, whole nother discussion, I know, and also their tenant spaces, and not include the offset component. And how they were going to get there was definitely still being figured out, but they weren't, losing time now. They were sort of setting more manageable goals on that pathway.
And that's an interesting question too, and another challenge altogether is that these goals are set at a very high level, but there's so many parties involved. So how does that message, how does that story get told, and how do you get the buy-in from everyone who is using your building? And that, I really think that speaks to that owner and tenant, or owner and resident relationship. How much information do your residents and tenants have? What is the level of education that's needed about the goals in general, right? The net zero goals, the carbon reduction goals, or sustainability and some of those features in general? Is it, and how does that message come across, right? And how do you build that relationship that says, hey, this is why we're asking for your data, or this is why we're signing, we're including this in lease language, or this is why we're talking about the energy use of your unit, or this is why we're talking about metering, how you get that message across and how you get that buy-in. I talked to a different member a couple of weeks ago about this program they were potentially thinking about rolling out, and they didn't end up doing it or rolling it out, but it was very interesting to me in that they had their bill pay program or administrator, and they were talking about having an additional cost to push all the individual metered units into Energy Star Portfolio Manager. And for those on the call who don't know that, that's the Energy Star application to track energy use data. So what they were thinking about doing is having the residents pay an additional admin fee. So pushing that back to the residents with the expectation that if their energy use is more closely managed, that their rent wouldn't absorb the wasted energy. So curious if you've heard of any concepts like that. Now, I didn't push this program through, so I don't know how the residents were notified of this or if that was even on the table, but I thought it was an interesting concept to really buy into that. There's this extra admin fee, whatever, if it's nominal or not nominal, maybe it's $5 a month or $50 a month, I'm not sure, but that the intention is to help you track energy use in the building, track energy use so that your utility costs, if the residents pay it, will be lowered. And I thought that was interesting. I hadn't really heard that being pushed through anywhere else. I'm curious if anyone on the call had.
I haven't. I'm sorry, Nicola.
No, that's okay. No, I haven't heard it directly. I think, tenants being hinted at that their rent is going to increase for something that, yes, obviously there's value and there's benefit for them, but I think if the idea is not coming from them, it feels that it's sort of pushed down. I do have a client that it was thinking of something similar, and I think piloting it out and did include it, because I think just as we've been saying that the kind of engagement, tenant, landlord engagement and communication line is so important, and they do communicate regularly through surveys as well as many other engagement means. But they alluded to that in a tenant survey, and the feedback was there was no gray. It was very much, do not increase our rent, for this. And I think it is possibly, like with many surveys, the wording of the survey too. And I suppose in hindsight, and I think that kind of has given them some pause, rightly, is rather than just, initiate a program, but that some actual tenant engagement and education and awareness raising is needed before you get to that point. So that tenants are already really understanding what, sustainability, ESG, the term, it's in terms and features that affect them. It's their recycling. We have recycling, but it's complicated. It's downstairs. I don't understand why you can't make these things easier for me. Bringing it actually to their everyday life and how they can get value from it. I think before insinuating that you need their help to, I suppose, meet your goals.
That's a great point. I think also, thinking beyond just our residents and our other stakeholders of how we approach those conversations. For example, our own development, and we're a developer and we have our own internal construction group. So how do we frame up conversations? And I think so much of what we do as ESG professionals is it's a lot of education, right? And it's not just education to our residents, but it's education to everybody that we're working with and our own internal associates, because truly not everybody understands exactly what ESG is. And there's so much to it. So helping folks understand the why. And to your point, Nicola, thinking about the resident experience. Well, are you having conversations on the development and construction side with folks who are involved with the design of your communities and thinking about that resident experience and the ergonomics and how you are approaching, yes, you might have a recycling room or a trash room or even composting, but what is that resident experience like getting to those places? And is there, wayfinding signage and educational materials involved in that process so they get it? So that I think is important to start from the beginning, and then also just internally how you frame up ESG and how you talk about it, and that you're repetitive and consistent, because that is your biggest friend, is constantly repeating your message over and over and over to get buy-in and make sure that people understand the why. And I'm not sure about others on the call, but we have many different equity partners that we work with, and we have different funds, and all of them have different approaches to ESG that you also have to take into account. And so thinking about how, your equity partners' ESG goals, how they interact with your own internal goals for you as an organization, and then how that's communicated out to everybody who's involved. All of those stakeholders along the way is huge. But that's such a good point about residents, helping them understand why, making sure your leasing staff on site also knows how to talk about it and connect those dots for the on-site folks, because if they don't get it, they're not going to talk about it effectively or at all. So that's really critical too.
I think it's interesting too that we're talking a lot about the corporate level goals, right? And I think as we're talking about the communication between tenants and owners, figuring out a way not only to engage tenants into what these goals are, but say, well, this is why it also benefits you. And maybe it is, so we've talked about the benefits of, yes, a building or corporation can prove their net zero status or their journey to net zero by measuring that whole building usage. They can comply with local climate and policy regulations and ordinances, but it could also, increase transparency with tenants and residents. It could build that trust with residents and ideally reduce turnover, saying, hey, these are the things we're doing in the journey to net zero, along with our other sustainability goals. It could enhance the marketability of the building. It could, lower operating costs that could trickle down to lowering rents or lowering utility bills, whatever, the methodology is there. And can, in general, just lead to plans that further reduce energy, that further reduce water and operating costs. So I think it really is a pathway for tenant engagement that can say, hey, we're doing this at a high level, but here are the benefits for you, and this is why we want your buy-in. I mean, it could, open the opportunity to think about including more measures to make a building healthier or more livable, and to have those materiality assessments at that resident level. What is important to you? Should we add a gym in the basement, or should we add a roof deck to have more open air opportunities? So really building that relationship, and it's not just this top down, but how to engage tenants and residents in that strategy, I think is key.
No, I would agree. And I think this is definitely where the S component for me comes in. I mean, that is their experience. I think the E is affects their wallet, of course, and that's the cost, but the E and the wellness, the health of their indoor environment, the accessibility to the outdoors, talked about, roof gardens, vegetable gardens, being grown on the top, being part of the community in terms of the building, access, just the paint quality. I know this is something that, in reading your ESG report, Mill Creek's ESG report is definitely a big focus, because I really feel that is how the tenant experiences the building. They may not realize it doesn't fall under ESG for them. This is just giving them a healthy environment in which to live in, raise their families in, as well as have access to amenities and bike racks and walkability to other services and things that they are experiencing in their day-to-day.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think kind of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, the data collection, we've made it a really intentional for us when we are collecting information on each of our communities. That is part of what we're tracking. We have, so many different data points we're collecting every single year for reporting, but we've intentionally integrated wellness kind of metrics that we're looking at because it's so important to us, right? That resident experience, and also just thinking about the different demographics that live in our spaces. And when you think about what's important to those demographics, especially younger generations, it is so important to them. And so being able to understand, are we meeting those metrics? Are we consistently building and designing our communities this way? And then the next element that I kind of alluded to earlier is, do our on-site teams understand how to communicate it and talk about it, is huge. And it's kind of that relationship along the way of connecting all those dots, collecting the data, but also the education and awareness piece. And then that trickles down to hopefully the resident having a really wonderful experience and living in a place that meets their needs and is aligned with their values.
Yeah, and that's very much taking it, asset level, of course, the resident at that particular building's experience. And then you mentioned, Kelly, the data that you are, collecting. So back up to data collecting, that data then, of course, can be multi-purpose. Its uses are multi-purpose. Of course, it can go out into ESG reports. It can be used for goal setting, but then also very importantly to some of the reporting frameworks, and of course to certifications, which is really then similar to an assurance or an audit, but it's really being able to demonstrate that particular asset, or of course portfolio-wide certifications, has really got that trusted assurance verification that that this new development or this, you know, renovation is meeting well, you know, standards.
Exactly.
And then,
oh, go ahead, Kurt.
we can answer a question, or I have a little bit of a challenge I wanted to pose.
Let's do
I know we
that.
talked a little bit about utility access and that maybe being a less of a lift to get data. If the utility is requiring, you know, information or a benchmarking ordinance, then it should be easy to get. But I wanted to challenge that a little bit, because in my experience working with a few clients before I was at ULI, a client was attempting to submit for GRES and get data from a bunch of their assets, and realizing that there was a bunch of benchmarking ordinances that they had to also make sure that they were being held to. And sometimes that button or that request had to come from a property manager, not the building owner, but the property manager on site. So as a consultant, I couldn't press the button and the owner couldn't press the button or ask. It had to come from the property manager. So that level of like adding, you know, another layer of someone who needs to understand why you're collecting the data, where it goes, what it does, and what button to push when property managers or operation managers have a long laundry list of to-dos for that day, was quite a challenge and really quite labor intensive. So even if that data existed and via the utility through a pretty easy button or an email, it was often difficult to get that message pushed across, you know, the entirety of a fund's assets. So curious if that had been either of your experience, or is it getting better? And that's sort of the fingers crossed, it's always getting better, but curious about that there.
I guess speaking from experience, we've always had a partner to help us with that, rather than putting the kind of heavy lift on our community managers, which I am a huge fan of. Take it off their plate. I mean, I worked on site originally when I joined the multifamily industry in the late 90s, and it's crazy. Like when you're on site, you think you can control your day and that you have, you know, your list of things you want to get done, but your day is often not up to you because you have, you know, hundreds of residents that you have to interact with and help. So relying on a vendor partner to help you manage that is critical, I think, and really should be, if you're not doing it today, should be one of the first things that you put into place to take that off and to help you manage all of that data.
Yes, I think, you know, we have seen a sort of a mixed selection. You know, obviously every client, every company is going to be different depending on the portfolio size. Smaller ones, obviously, it's easier to have those communications, that training, just make them aware. I think so much of this, as we've talked about at many different levels, leasing office, community managers, it's just awareness and sort of putting in that time at the beginning so that they can understand, listen, if you get this request to, you know, the setup form for the Energy Star portfolio, you know, this is why, and we'd really appreciate, you know, if you can just put in these details. And of course, getting their buy-in as well as some of that data access or setup information will then make future requests so much easier and more streamlined.
Yeah.
Questions? Did you have some questions for us, Amanda?
There was just one actually, and it kind of got it to what Kara was talking about, and you all answered it beautifully. It was asking about recommendations to promote buy-in from on-site staff. So I think kind of to build off of that, is there anyone that is experienced in you know, industry proposed financial incentives, so like bonuses to get the on-site staff to do what they're being requested to do? That was kind of another add-on to that question.
I could speak to that a little. It's not something we're doing here at Mill Creek, but in a past life, we attempted to, and I say attempted because it wasn't fully successful. I think it's really difficult, but I also do think it's really important to tie ESG in some way, shape, or form to performance reviews to job descriptions, so everybody has buy-in, right? And to you know, to leadership. We're kind of at the early stages of just starting to talk about what makes sense for us as a company. But previously, what we had done at another organization was provide almost like a scorecard around our sustainability program that we had. And there was a lot to it on the back end because we needed to visualize it in a way. So kind of a lot of work with our data folks internally of kind of building out this scorecard that our site teams then got quarterly. And they were able to see a scorecard of how their community was meeting our sustainability requirements, and then provided recommendations of how to improve that. We then had to build training around it. So there was that awareness piece. So every associate was, you know, went through training to learn, you know, what this meant and the why. And then it was tied to kind of their KPIs that each community was trying to follow. So in theory, it seemed like a great idea, but in practice, it was really, really challenging. And we went through multiple iterations of the report. There was always a lot of confusion. So I think if you can simplify it in a way, tie it to job descriptions, build training, and just keep at it, I think there is a solution. It's just, we haven't gotten there yet with Mill Creek, but I do think that it's a place that we'll get to eventually. And then in the past, we were kind of learning as we were going and trying trying different things to hopefully land on something that worked. I don't know if Nicola or Kara, if you've ever
to build on that, and again, you know, where GRESB, I suppose, can be a great guide is and anyone on the call who's familiar with GRESB, but that certainly is in their leadership section, is something that they are very much looking for. Fairly open-ended, because of course companies are doing it differently, but that it is so important at all levels of the company. So whether it's going from the board to the C-suite, the investment committee, and then anyone really who has ESG as part of, you know, either their whole job description or obviously a component, that there is a tie of financial or non-financial, you know, many times it's awards, it's training, incentives to actually meeting ESG goals and kind of performance metrics. And I think that really is so critical, because the time has just gone where this can be someone's job, you know, post their 9-to-5 job. This cannot be something that's just this add-on. And that really, if companies want to be doing this well, it is part of so many people's job descriptions. You know, if you need a cross-functional ESG task force to sort of identify what your ESG program should look like, then really everyone and those people and those teams should fall and should have some form of, as you say, as part of a job description or in a performance review, that be part of their assessment.
And I think that incentive-based model makes a lot of sense, but I think I've seen a little bit on the other side as well, at least with ordinances or requirements, where if there is a fine associated with not complying, flipping that back to the property that is not in compliance, as opposed to the corporate level, saying that, you know, hey, we asked for this data, this is why we needed it, we didn't get it in time, we have this fine, it gets flipped back to the property, which is more of a stick side than a carrot. But I think that we'll be seeing that as well. Now, I haven't seen a lot of enforcement of fines, truth be told, but I think that will come as the ordinances and requirements get more mature in use and folks buy into that. I'm curious, Nicola, from your experience with clients, do you have any success stories you can share that, you know, we were working with this client, they had 5% data coverage, and now, you know, through this method or that method, they are at 75%, or maybe that's too big of a gap. But I'm curious to see what, you know, your work has been and what has been successful in terms of strategies.
Yeah, so I think and reaching out to some of our internal teams, that really, you know, having a third-party utility management provider is probably, you know, like our Gobi platform is really the most streamlined way to access both benefit the client, because obviously you're handling a lot of the tasks for them, the bill pay, billing back to the tenants, but it does mean that we then have access to all of that data and can very clearly then track where we are as a percentage of completeness, and therefore, really hone down some suggestions of whether we then need to fill those gaps with LOAs, which of course do definitely work, but present, as we kind of touched on at the very beginning, they present some challenges too, whether it's, privacy issues, just language barriers in some cases, just the format, the formality of it. And then I think, then further down is obviously trying to get the aggregate data, which we also touched on, which again has its challenges. So it's really this kind of pie that we're trying to fill with all the slices, using all the tools in our toolbox, I think, to try and help our clients get to that complete coverage.
And one thing just to add on to that is don't feel like you have to do everything today, because it's just not, feasible, and that's not sustainable. So just having that continuous mindset, kind of continuous improvement mindset, I should say, is really important. What can I do that's feasible today? And then, next year, kind of when you're planning for your initiatives for the next year, what can I add on and what can I add on, and continue to work with all of your third-party vendors and internally to just continually improve the data quality and the data coverage piece of it. And you'll get there. It just takes time.
No, that's such a good point, Kelly, because if you are just beginning, just focus on one market. It doesn't, don't necessarily worry about all the data that you don't have, but identify a market, representative, an important market, whether it's because of a benchmarking requirement or a different requirement, and just start your approach there. And then of course that can then be scaled.
Exactly.
Those are great pieces of feedback on that data completeness conversation. It's so challenging from anything that has to
go on and on, can't it? It's unsolvable.
And I definitely, to add to what Nicola said, I definitely think a third party is one of the simplest paths of least resistance, especially from a multifamily or even a single family perspective. LOAs aren't exactly an option in that space, at least in a traditional sense. So having someone that's able to just bill back the resident for their usage is incredibly valuable. To kind of add on to this tenant discussion and figuring out how initiatives can work, we had a question about the tenant engagement floor by floor study that you mentioned, Nicola. What were the results of that? What was learned?
Well, yes, so sadly it hasn't actually taken place yet, so I don't have those. We were just speccing it out. I was very excited about it because I think great to work, with, and there's, with a company that is so conscious of that this is this big loophole in terms of, the buildings that they own, but really the operational component of it can be, just the common area, the common, utility space. So, I think it would be it would have to be only very specific buildings. You would need to have very much like for like floors, units that you could then represent and do the engagement on the odd or the even floors, but track it, let's say, across all floors, full floors. So I hope that either this pilot or somebody else is inspired to try this out, because I think the results would be so immediate and so obvious that it feels like a simple exercise that would yield many very positive results.
Also provide the test case for the rest of your
Absolutely. Absolutely, because it would just be in one particular market. Yeah.
So there's another question about multifamily operators and how much control they might have over a resident space. For example, installing smart thermostats in units, Can a landlord control those set points, so the range in which those smart thermostats can operate?
Yes, I can speak to that briefly. Our kind of smart thermostats and a lot of the in-home technology is handled with it. We have a different department that kind of directly oversees innovative technology and works directly with our development and construction groups to get technology in. But first and foremost, one of their kind of foundational pillars that they always look for is that kind of centralized control and data accessibility. So how can we tap into those results to understand how the technology is being used? And so absolutely, and I know there's vendors out there because I've spent some time over this past year just trying to learn and understand it and talk to some of them. And especially with demand response, there are some really interesting programs that help kind of control and tap into the demand response elements at your communities for savings and do some like peak shaving of energy during certain times of the day. And I think that's really important. Again, I know we talked about this very, very early on in this webinar, but like really having good collaboration with your vendor partners and making sure that you understand what is their capability to help you with data accessibility and also managing systems. Or, you know, if you've got thinking of common area spaces too, you know, building automation systems to be able to centralize stuff. I mean, on both aspects, it's really, really important to be able to do that in your apartment homes and externally. I'd be sensitive though, because I think residents can get a little finicky about how much you're managing their technology in their home. So just, I think that's a sensitive area for sure.
I think just a little add, oh, sorry, Kara.
I was just gonna say it's important too that even if a smart thermostat is included in a unit, that the resident knows how to use it. I had an experience where we were talking about smart thermostats and the property managers knew how to use it and they were going around and helping all the residents in a senior living facility figure it out. And there was a big language barrier that no one anticipated. So then now there's a language barrier that is a barrier to having the resident understand how to use it. And that was sort of a light bulb moment for me in this particular situation, where it's not just about the education piece, it's looking at the diversity of your residents to make sure that everyone can be educated and at the same level when it comes to new technologies.
Yeah, and then I was just gonna add just one other piece there is that this could also be an area for a green lease, in that the landlord could then state that they are responsible for the installation and the repairs, but that the tenant will abide by, you know, to set the thermostats between this and this and you know. So less high tech, but certainly a way to ask that the tenants take some responsibility there.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's definitely something that we've implemented into our lease language is that certain temperatures to be set at. And again, you can't control tenant behavior, but if it's there, it's in writing, it's something to fall back on. And again, the education and awareness piece is so, so important.
Exactly.
Absolutely. We have one more minute left. I think we might have time for one more question. Do you all have any suggestions on best practices from the development side? So as one is developing a multifamily asset, I know you spoke to this a little bit earlier, Kelly, and making sure that you're thinking about those sub-meters at the time of development. Any other suggestions?
I would say, just from a high level perspective, to really work closely with your development and construction teams on integrating sustainability and wellness aspects into the standards. And it's not easy. It's something that we're actually going through right now and I think it needs to be an ongoing process, something you revisit consistently, because technology changes so fast. Expectations are changing so fast, and our equity partner requirements are changing so fast and evolving in this whole space of net zero, and it's just the need for it is changing so rapidly. And so when you think about a community you're developing today, or that might already be in pre-development stage, those standards might not apply to it. So what you're trying to put into place today might not actually take root and take effect for a couple of years, because you're already kind of going down the road with the development and construction of your existing communities. So, but yeah, work closely and understand, okay, what are the elements we need to do, whether it's energy and water and wellness and material use and all of that, and work to get it fully integrated into your standards, and then keep at it and reassess it annually or biannually, whatever cadence makes sense for you.
Amazing. All right, well, we are at time, so that concludes today's webinar. The recording will be distributed within about 24 hours. If you have any additional questions for our speakers, feel free to reach out. We're all happy to help. Thank you so much for joining us.